מה נשמע חברים, המלחמה בין ישראל לאיראן הרבה יותר חמורה ממה שחשבתם. אחת הסקירות הטובות ביותר על המלחמה בין ישראל לאיראן.
The Cold War has turned hot overnight. In the early hours of June 13th, Israel launched preemptive strikes on Iran. Multiple explosions were heard across Tehran, with online footage showing blasts lighting up the capital. But the fire that started in the city didn't stop there. Additional explosions occurred in Isfahan, Tabriz, Kermanshah, Hamadan, Qom, and Piranshah, cities that host nuclear, military, or strategic sites. Separate strikes also hit the Natanz nuclear site, the Arak heavy water reactor, and the Parchin military complex. Satellite imagery, for instance, shows considerable but likely superficial damage at Natanz. Either way, the initial 24 hours have been nothing short of a disaster for the Iranians. Israeli jets are flying almost uncontested over Iranian airspace. Mossad operatives are roaming freely, launching drones and anti-tank guided missiles at key Iranian systems, all while Hezbollah remains on the sidelines. Already, multiple senior nuclear scientists and high-ranking military leaders have been killed. As was bound to happen, Iran responded harshly and launched waves of loitering munitions and ballistic missiles at Israel. Most of these were intercepted in the air, but some made it through. Tel Aviv was hit multiple times, and significant damage has been reported at Israel's Central Military Command Center. What we're seeing is unlike anything the region has witnessed before. The firepower unleashed makes Hezbollah and Hamas rockets look like toys by comparison. Meanwhile, Netanyahu has urged Israeli citizens to prepare for a prolonged conflict. And so it begins. When sirens replace speeches, war is no longer coming. It has arrived. In the immediate aftermath, Iran launched more than 100 drones toward Israel and vowed further retaliation. For its part, America has chosen not to intervene. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio insists the US had no role in the attacks, while President Trump is urging Iran to make a deal or face even more brutal attacks. This may well be a good cop, bad cop negotiating tactic. Around 260 media outlets reported on this story, most of them right-leaning. This is also how governments negotiate when they try to talk without saying things directly. They employ the media. But even so, reaching a deal now will be difficult. Among the casualties is Ali Shamkhani, a close confidant of the supreme leader and Iran's chief nuclear negotiator. So there's a lot to piece together when it comes to understanding what's coming next. I use ground news to connect the dots because it allows me to check out local and regional sources. I truly believe that is the best way to understand this tricky region. I can't stress enough how important this is, which is why I asked Ground News to sponsor this video. I mainly browse the Blind Spot page, where they share lots of interesting stories that other news outlets often miss 50% off the vantage. As of this time, the full extent of Israel's attack on Iran is still unknown. The initial strikes appear to have targeted radars, air defenses, aircraft, and control towers, which paves the way for follow-up attacks on secondary sites. Israel's attention will now turn to the secondary targets of strategic and economic nature, such as ports, refineries, and missile factories. The Israeli military said as much when it described the operation as the first stage, signaling that more attacks could follow in the next few days, if not weeks. But even if Israel's next wave of attacks is tactically successful, dismantling Iran's nuclear program entirely would require direct American involvement. Without US involvement, Israel can't do it. At best, they might delay Iran's progress by 1 to 2 years. At worst, the strikes could backfire, prompting Iran to rapidly assemble a crude nuclear device as a deterrent against future attacks. Though Israel claims its goal is to take out Iran's nuclear program and prevent it from building a nuclear bomb, its actions suggest a deeper objective: regime change. All the Israeli attacks have so far targeted IRGC officials while avoiding the leadership of Iran's regular armed forces, which may be a calculated attempt at divide and rule. You see, the Revolutionary Guards and the regular military often operate at odds, with the IRGC holding dominance in both political and economic spheres. So, by degrading the IRGC, Israel may be trying to provoke internal friction, perhaps even encouraging the regular military to turn against the Revolutionary Guards in a bid for power. Tellingly, Israel's campaign is called Operation Rising Lion, which is likely a nod to the pre-revolution Iranian flag and suggests that regime change may be the ultimate objective. Whether that gamble pays off is another question entirely. Comparably, Tehran's strategy is also regime change, but through more legal means. The Iranians know they can't change Netanyahu's mind, but they might just be able to collapse his government by building up domestic pressure and triggering a vote of no confidence. To do this, Iranians will need to deliver maximum harm to Israel, but do so by focusing on infrastructure, military, and leadership targets while avoiding civilian sites as much as possible, which may be difficult in practice. And so the Iranians will want to launch waves of missiles at Israel day after day in the hope that it might lead to a vote of no confidence. This would be a political victory that helps Tehran save face and boost its position in future negotiations. But again, there is no guarantee that it would work. Regime change is less a strategy than a roll of the dice. The behavior of both Iran and Israel in the coming weeks will depend on a mix of military, political, regional, and strategic factors. Even a slight shift in one variable, like a US statement of support, could trigger ripple effects that drastically alter their next moves. In such a volatile moment, weak retaliation from Iran won't deter Israel, but a strong one risks drawing America into the war. That's precisely what Israel may try to provoke, escalating in hopes of pulling America in. By contrast, Iran will likely aim to respond in a way that shows strength and re-establishes deterrence while avoiding a wider conflict. What the Iranians will likely want are strikes that preserve an off-ramp for de-escalation, for example, by giving advance warning to the United States and regional countries. It took a similar approach during Operation True Promise in April 2024 when it launched a large-scale drone and missile attack on Israel, but avoided triggering a wider conflict. So, at this stage, it's a matter of sustainment versus escalation. Israel may have deflected much of Iran's first few waves of attacks, but its stockpile of interceptors won't hold out forever. Iran can try to wear down Israeli defenses, fire enough missiles at enough targets, and some will inevitably get through. However, Iran will face attrition of its own. Drones are plentiful but relatively easy to shoot down. Ballistic missiles are far more destructive and harder to intercept, but they're not easily replaced. Iran is believed to have an arsenal of around 3,000 ballistic missiles. While not all have the range to reach Israel, enough could break through Israeli and US air defenses to inflict serious damage and force Netanyahu's political hand. So again, it comes down to a strategy of sustainment versus escalation. In years past, Iran wouldn't have relied solely on its missiles. Its first line of defense was its network of Arab proxies, specifically Hezbollah. But after a year of fighting with Israel, Hezbollah is now much weaker. Many of its leaders have been killed, and much of its hierarchy has been infiltrated by Mossad agents. Hezbollah still has a large missile and rocket arsenal, but using them now would be politically risky. The Lebanese government is struggling to rebuild and has warned Hezbollah not to drag the country into another war on Iran's behalf. Thus, Hezbollah is sitting this one out. Alternatively, to re-establish deterrence, Iran could employ its proxies to launch a series of attacks on American forces stationed in Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. At the same time, the Houthis in Yemen could launch missiles at Israel and possibly target remaining US naval ships in the Red Sea. However, this would be a terribly risky move. Directly attacking US assets could prompt retaliation against the Iranian leadership, something akin to the January 2020 assassination of Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. The end result could see the US Air Force doing even more damage than Israel's airstrikes. Another way for Iran to establish deterrence, and less expected, would be to strike US allies in the Gulf region. For example, Iran could use its proxies to attack oil facilities in Saudi Arabia like it did in 2019, or hit targets in the UAE as it did in 2022. Attacking the oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf region, including ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz, would almost certainly cause oil prices to surge. In such a scenario, Gulf leaders who have pledged hundreds of billions in investments to the United States would likely push Trump to rein in Israel and halt its attacks on Iran. There is no guarantee that it would work, but sometimes the shortest path to victory goes through someone else's backyard. Having said that, any Iranian attack on Gulf Arab states, while possible, would likely end the improving diplomatic ties Iran has worked to build with those countries in recent years. So every form of retaliation carries some risk of blowback. Yet, perhaps the strongest form of deterrence for Iran would be to conduct a nuclear test. It would signal to both Israel and the United States that Iran is no longer bluffing about its nuclear ambitions, but it would also provoke international outrage, trigger new sanctions, and deepen Iran's isolation. Still, if the Iranian government sees its survival at stake, the supreme leader may decide the cost is worth it. A nuclear test would force the Israelis and Americans to weigh the risk of turning a conventional conflict into a nuclear one. At the very least, Tehran may opt for a non-kinetic response, one that signals nuclear intent but keeps it ambiguous enough to avoid immediate escalation. Iranian officials have long warned they would leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty if their nuclear program came under military attack. That moment may now be near. Overall, the course of both Israeli and Iranian actions in the coming weeks will depend on the scale and intensity of what each side does next. The longer the attacks continue and the more damage they inflict, the smaller the window for de-escalation. With every strike and counterstrike, controlling what comes next grows more difficult, because despite best efforts, precision strikes rarely end with precision outcomes. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you approve of what we do, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and